totally prepared for this. I went through almost my whole book, almost not reading it all, but going through and making notes, and so I could cover this pretty extensively and handle any questions anyone has. And this, of course, is the meat of General Putnam's life. This is why most people know of him, and appreciate him, is because of what he did during the time of the American Revolution. He's known as, when he finished the French and Indian War, he obtained the rank of colonel, but he never was really a general, except except he achieved high rank in the Connecticut militia. That was as high as he got up until 1775. Now, I'm going to start at one story which has been repeated over and over again, because this is really the beginning of the revolution for him, although he did furnish the patriots in Boston earlier with a herd of sheep, which he personally brought to Massachusetts from his Connecticut farm. And he also had a skirmish with a British ship a few months before in Boston. But this is the big time. The big time was April 1775. We have the battles of Lexington and Concord. And in Lexington, if you remember, British troops for the first time fired on and killed a number of American patriots right on the Lexington Green. And then the British marched on to Concord, which is to the west, and all the way the Americans attacked them from behind trees, behind rocks, behind fences, just like guerrilla warfare, until they got to Concord. And the British were looking for the storage of American armaments. By the time they got there, there was another big fight on the bridge in Concord. And then the British retreated all the way back to Boston, and all the way they were fired upon. So this went, everyone in New England within a week knew about what happened. But Israel heard about it right away, because a writer came down to Connecticut from Boston and came to Israel's farm up in Pomfret, Brooklyn, Connecticut. And Israel was out with his young son, Daniel. Daniel was about 15 years old, and they were plowing one of Israel's fields. Israel took the reins to the oxen, gave it to Daniel, and immediately got on a horse and headed not north, but south, down to Lebanon, Connecticut, to get instructions from the governor of Connecticut, who was back at his home in Lebanon. After he received those instructions, he got back on the horse, headed to Boston, and for the next 18 hours, he traveled approximately 100 miles to join the fight. Unfortunately for him, by the time he got there, the battle was over, but he stayed 2 weeks. He stayed 2 weeks to join up, to meet some of the patriots up there and to discuss what the next steps would be and what was, in effect, the planning of the Battle of Bunker Hill, which would occur in 2 months' time. Any questions? Okay. Battle of Bunker Hill, June 1775. This not only was the first major battle of the war, but it was also the bloodiest. Even though the war would last another 7 years, this was the most bruising battle for both sides. In the end, over 1,000 British casualties would occur, and half that many Americans. However, even though the British casualties were much greater, the Americans lost in the end. When Israel got there, there was a dispute about who would be in command. The the general who really was in command of the Boston troops, Artemus Ward, a militia general, he was very sickly and he really couldn't fight, but he could, behind the lines, he could help plan the battle. So it was left up to 3 or 4 guys to plan what was going to happen on the American side. Israel, William Prescott, who was a colonel in the militia of Massachusetts, Joseph Warren, who was a medical doctor and is actually the medical doctor for John and Abigail Adams, for them and their family. And the 4th important person was John Stark, who was a colonel in the militia of New Hampshire. So those were the key players. I would think, my own personal opinion is, William Prescott, the Massachusetts colonel, probably played a big part in the planning because he had the most men by far. Israel had his Connecticut militia, but in terms of numbers, they weren't very big. And the lion's share of the American side lion's share of the fighting fell to the Massachusetts troops. So William Prescott, as the commander of those troops, probably had a big say. Anyway, the battle started, just before the battle, evening of April 16th, 1775, Putnam, Prescott, and a bunch of the troops, the militia, went up onto the peninsula north of Boston, the Charlestown Peninsula, and there were 2 or 3 large hills up there, and they were going to go over to Bunker Hill and create a little earthworks fort on the top of it and confront the British in the morning. You could see from that hill the British occupied city of Boston in the distance. However, for one reason or another, they didn't do that. They went to Breed's Hill instead. And Breed's Hill to the south overlooked the one town on the peninsula, Charlestown, and it overlooked really closely the city of Boston. So it was really provocative. My guess is Israel Putnam had a big say in doing that because he would be just like the kind of guy, the kind of fighter who would want to provoke the British. So that's what they did. They built their fortifications on that hill in the middle of the night. And the next morning, the British ships in the harbor were shocked. They looked up and there was a fort that wasn't there the evening before at sunset. So immediately the commander, General Howe, the British commander, General Howe, got together with his main officers, and they planned on attacking Breed's Hill. It's a battle of Bunker Hill, but it was really on Breed's Hill, attacking it in the afternoon. And that's what they did. They sent troops up there and they were repelled by the Americans. And the British were shocked because these Americans were just farmers. However, one thing they didn't really count on was the American troops were led by 3 colonels from the French and Indian War. And these 3, Putnam, Prescott, and New Hampshire Stark, were experienced at guerrilla fighting because all of them served as rangers during the French and Indian War for the British, ironically. And they knew tactics of the British, the French, and the Native Americans. And they were experts. Now, the troops they commanded were almost all farmers, tradesmen, those kind of people. And they weren't that experienced. They had trained on the local town commons in New England and, had some experience, but it was the commanders, I think, that really carried the day for the Americans at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Anyway, the second time the British attacked the fortifications, they were repelled again. The third time, the Americans started running out of ammunition. And you can't defend anything if you don't have ammunition. And so they had to retreat. And that, in my opinion, was Putnam's greatest contribution to the Battle of Bunker Hill, is that he organized and led the retreat off that peninsula. And as a peninsula, it had a very narrow inlet. So if the British had gone around to the north, which, by the way, was protected by the New Hampshire troops of Stark. So that helped a lot too. But if they had gone around to the north and cut off the Americans, they could have destroyed the whole force under Prescott and Putnam. But they didn't do it. They got off the peninsula just in time and went on to Cambridge. Now you have to remember, Washington had not been appointed commander of the Continental Army yet. So he had nothing to do with this. This was the Continental Army, and these were the commanders, right, at this point, at least for these until a few weeks away. The most well-known saying at the Battle of Bunker Hill today is, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." And for almost 250 years, that has been the biggest item disputed about the battle. That's kind of funny. Okay, here's the bloodiest battle, but the most disputed thing is a quotation. Anyway, no one knows who said it, but it was probably either Prescott or Putnam. And I have a poster, and if I wasn't rushing to get this attachment to the internet connected, I was going to bring it up and post it behind me. And that poster is from a postage stamp from 1975, the 200th anniversary of Bunker Hill, and it shows the death of Joseph Warren, the other patriot, and it shows Putnam off to the side with his sword up in the air leading the retreat. Except in that postage stamp, that part was cut off so you don't see Putnam. But on this poster that I purchased on eBay of that postage stamp, a great big poster that was in the post office, up in the corner or on the side, it says, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes, ... Israel Putnam." So they appreciated that he might have said that, even though they cut off his picture. And so that's the reason I purchased that thing. Anyway, I have a couple quotations here I want to read by veterans of the Battle of Bunker Hill and what they said about Putnam and what he was doing. Here's one man, Reuben Kemp, and he said, "General Putnam seemed to have the ordering of things. He charged the men not to fire on the enemy until they came close to the works, then take good aim and make sure every shot killed a man. And he told one officer to see that this order was obeyed." That sounds very much though like "don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." And then another man, Joseph Spaulding, who was only 19 years old at the time, he was also the first man to fire a shot at the Battle of Bunker Hill. A little prematurely, however, because he said, "I fired ahead of time and Putnam rushed up and struck me for violating orders. I suppose I deserved it, but I was anxious to get another good shot at Gage's men ever since our affair at Concord. The blow from old Put hit me in the head, made a hole in my hat, and left this scar." After hitting Spaulding, Putnam threatened to use his sword on the next soldier who wasted a musket charge. Okay. One man who did not leave his post later recalled, "General Putnam came to one of the cannon, near where I stood and furiously inquired where our officers were. On being told our cartridges were too big and the pieces that could not be loaded, he swore and said they could be loaded. Taking a cartridge, he broke it open and loaded the pieces with a ladle, which were discharged, and assisted us in loading 2 or 3 more times in that manner." And that's what Putnam did a lot at the battle. He went around on his horse and saw to it that everyone was fighting, saw to it that new troops were being brought up from the end of the peninsula, saw to it that retreating troops were safely brought backwards. Here's another one. Others saw him, Putnam, or this is a quotation from his biography. Others saw him, Putnam, at the action at the rail fence. They saw him on horseback amidst flying balls when they expected every moment to see him fall from his horse. And he was one of the very, very few people who had a horse there. Okay, the battle's over. Putnam has really earned his place in history here. There's veterans who are talking about his role there, as well as the role of the other heroes, the Prescott and
He'll be back soon.
Professor, you're frozen. We don't know if you know that, but you're frozen to us.
I think he actually has been dropped from the call. Oh, no, apparently he's still there.
Dropped himself. He could try to get back on. I'm sure he'll try to get back on.
Right.
I had him pinned and he just disappeared, so he'll be right back.
Right.
Here's the stamp.
Oh,
Hold that up again.
John, it's from a John Trumbull painting.
Closer and center it, Paul, please.
can you send a picture of that, like
Thank
just
you, Paul.
the screenshot of that to everyone?
Oh, it's an easy Google thing.
Well, just so that we have it.
Okay, I don't know. How do I do?
You just searched
Oh.
Stamp Bunker Hill.
I did Battle of Bunker Hill stamp 1975 because there's a couple of them. I have this stamp in my collection. That was a great
He's
time. when
definitely
they
not
were
on the call. So what do we do?
He'll be back.
I think he'll be back. Yeah. I wanted to ask about what exactly these fortifications would be like. I'm having trouble picturing what that, I don't know if anybody knows anything about stuff like what kind of fortifications you could build overnight.
Right.
That I'm curious to find out about that.
You know what I learned about at the Battle of Stony Point was what an abattoir was. And these are literally trees they cut down, but they put them on their side so that the enemy is facing all the branches. And that's, you can't mount that, you can't climb that, you can't. So, I mean, that could be something easy to do. Of course, you could always dig in.
That's super old. I mean, I think people have been doing that forever.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's without materials.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting. The French and Indian War, which the British won, actually trained a bunch of people to then defeat them during the Revolutionary War.
Yep.
One of those bad ironies of life. I think in the stamp, the person, I think that's where that doctor is killed at Bunker Hill. I forget the name of Dr. Anybody remember it?
Could it have been General Warren? My search suggests General Warren died at Bunker Hill.
Was it Dr. Warren who died? The painting shows him being bayoneted and somebody keeping the
It says Dr. Joseph Warren.
That is Dr. Warren?
He's working on getting his way back. So just an FYI.
Yeah, these were a bunch of little mini paintings that Trumbull did. They're at the Yale Art Museum. And he was hoping that Congress would give him the commission to paint gigantic versions of these for the rotunda in Washington, but he only got hired to do 4 of them.
So I don't know if anybody knows anything about it, but I was just thinking about how important it is that you would have an organized retreat. I think, yeah, like if we think about having basically farmers or non-professional soldiers, what can happen at the end of, in a battle is once you have people start running away, you just have a rout, and then you're defeated for sure. So I think that's an underappreciated sometimes part of fighting a battle.
Yeah, in Brooklyn, that's what happened. There was not an organized retreat, and they all went heading towards the to the shoreline where the actual little tiny village of Brooklyn was. Actually, people drowned in the Kiwanis River. Now it's the canal, but because nobody knew how to swim in those days, you didn't go into water. Rivers were basically sewers, like the Hudson a few years ago.
Okay, Greg, you should be good to go if you wanted to share your screen of the Trumbull painting.
That
Beautiful.
work?
Mm-hmm.
Greg, who's the guy in the lower right?
Okay, Greg, you should be the Trumbull painting.
Oh, that's cool.
Ooh, someone has a wicked delay.
I assume that's General Warren in center left, dying.
Right.
Perhaps Professor Hubbard can tell us where, which is Israel Putnam. He said the stamp was only a portion of this painting, didn't include Putnam.
The stamp only shows the left-hand side.
So it could be Putnam in the flashy hat.
Well, it looks kind of young for Putnam. You know, I took one of those online courses on American art, and this was one of the paintings they talked about, but I forgot who he said the people down there on the lower right are.
Okay, Greg, if you could stop your screen share, I think the professor is back. There he is. Mhm. And connecting to audio. So,
Believe it, just as you were coming on, I see a picture of the stamp. Well, you're better at doing this than I am. I hope no one left. I think I'm all set now.
It's actually the painting, Professor Hubbard, not just the stamp. Maybe
Oh,
you
was
can-
it the painting? Then
Yeah.
that means you must see Israel off on the left side. The viewer's left. Is he there? Yeah, you can just barely see it. Looks like they cut off part of him, but they think you can still see his white head. Can you still see it there? He's
Well,
on the very, very far left holding it. I think they cut him off there.
in a blue jacket or,
Yeah, the blue jacket.
okay.
I think you see part of him. You see a rather overweight man with a balding, like white hair, and that's Israel. Okay. Let me get off this a little bit. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Because everyone's been so patient and had to go through these delays, what I'm going to do is I have some pencils, which I've given out at some of my in-person book talks, pencils which say Major General Israel Putnam on them, and I'm going to mail a bunch of them to Kiki, and she can give them out to members of the society down there.
All
But
right.
only people that have been watching tonight. I don't have that many. Anyway, I also would like to make a note. She mentioned that you were just talking about the stamp, the 1975 stamp. That reminds me, when I gave a talk up at the Historical Society at Danvers, Massachusetts, at Putnam's birthplace a couple of years ago, I had the idea, and those folks up there had an idea at the same time, of writing to a committee in Washington, D.C. that proposes new stamps, new postage stamps, because in a few years, it'll be the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill, 2025. And I would like to see stamps, a set of stamps with those 4 Patriot leaders who I just mentioned on those stamps, as well as a stamp commemorating the Battle of Bunker Hill, which I assume they will automatically have. So I will be suggesting that. I see there the picture of the stamp, and you don't even see the guy in the blue uniform off to the left on that. So I'm going to, I would suggest, and I'm going to probably write to everywhere, all the different places I've given talks, that in a couple years, we write away to that committee and suggest stamps on these Revolutionary War heroes. So let me proceed. Are you there, Kiki?
Yes.
Yep, we're all here.
Yeah,
Everybody's
we're
there?
all here. Mhm.
Okay, excellent. Okay, here I go. The Battle of Bunker Hill's over. Continental Congress decided they're going to appoint George Washington Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Within days after that, they appointed 4 major generals to serve directly under Washington. Those 4 generals were New York businessman Philip Schuyler, who was very wealthy. He was 41 years old. All the rest except one were in their 40s. 2, Artemus Ward, who I mentioned, who led the militia up in Massachusetts. He was a Harvard graduate, very intelligent, and also very wealthy. You can visit his home today, which, by the way, is managed by Harvard University. And 3, Charles Lee, who actually had this tremendous military background, where he not only was in the French and Indian War for the British, but he also served in Portugal, and he served as an aide to the King of Poland. And he came over because he thought he was going to get the job that George Washington ultimately got, but he didn't. But he got to be like one of the number 2 guys. He also spoke 6 languages. Very accomplished person. And the 4th person was a man who was uneducated, who was a sheep farmer from Connecticut. And of course, that was Israel Putnam. And he was by far the oldest of the group at 57 years old. So the 4 of them served directly under Putnam, and they would, in all, as I mentioned last time, there would be about 75 generals of the Continental Army. There'd be other generals, there'd be militia generals, but about 75. In the next few years, many of the older ones dropped out, were appointed and dropped out. And in about 3 years, Putnam became the oldest one. As he turned 60, 61 years old, no one else was older than him and still serving as a general in the Army, either a major general or a brigadier general. The next year, after 1775, the next year was one of the big battles of the war coming up in the summer of 1776. But first we had the Declaration of Independence, which everyone knows on July of 1776. That got the British really angered. Okay, the Parliament in London and the British brass were really excited about doing something, and they took some serious steps. And what they did do is they took a fleet of ships from Boston. They left Boston earlier in the year because they were pushed out by Washington's troops. They went to New York City. Then they took a fleet from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and they brought that down. But most of all, they took a fleet from Britain, came across the Atlantic, and they converged with the others on New York City. Right there was this massive fleet of ships that was believed to be the largest grouping of warships in the history of the world up until that time. 400 ships. It was also believed to be the largest grouping of warships, the largest fleet until the Battle of D-Day in World War II. So this was like big. The British couldn't do anything more. In 2001, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and most of you were in New York and probably voted for him or against him when he was a senator. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was, before he became a senator, a historian, he spoke before one of the Senate committees on national parks, and he said this of Governor's Island off Brooklyn. If this island is little known, it is essentially because it has been a military base since the Revolutionary War and is generally off limits to the public. This is no ordinary military encampment. On the contrary, sir, it could be argued that we owe our national existence to the fortifications which General Israel Putnam threw up on April 1776 on the Buttermilk Channel side, which is just a baseball's throw from Brooklyn Heights. Right to the west of Brooklyn, he put up the fortifications. Now, stepping back just a few weeks, Nathaniel Greene, who was the general of Washington's, who was in charge of the troops in New York City, took very sick and they thought he was going to die. He could not command troops. So with only 3 days left before the battle, Washington replaced the temporary commander with Israel Putnam. So here he is, Israel Putnam. He has just a few days to obtain information on his troops, survey the layout, and now command 10,000 troops on the end of Long Island. Meanwhile, he is, as I said, has 400 ships opposing him with 32,000 British, Scott, and Hessian troops. So here he is with 3 times as many troops opposing him. Never in Israel's life did he ever command anything near 10,000 troops. Okay, he was a fighting man. He was a fighting man, a captain, then a major, then a colonel during the French and Indian War. He was a leader in the militia in Connecticut. He was appointed major general the previous year, and he commanded hundreds and hundreds of troops, but not 10,000. And so he did make a mistake. The troops were not properly covering all the passes into their encampments, and British did get in. Now, probably they would have gone in anyway, and Washington never really criticized Putnam for what happened in the loss of Long Island, but it ended up that they had to leave. And Washington came over to help Putnam, and they left in the middle of the night on their barges and their rowboats and just made it across before daylight from Brooklyn to Manhattan Island. And there they sat for the next few weeks with Israel Putnam and 3,000 or so troops down in the southern end of Manhattan, where the World Trade Center and Wall Street districts are today, and Washington with about 5,000 more up in Harlem. And unfortunately, the British attacked at Kips Bay. Now, there's no Kips Bay there today because they filled it in over the centuries, but there was a bay approximately where the United Nations building is. And the British took their forces, land and sea, and they attacked that. Israel Putnam in the south end of the island actually heard the gunfire and went up north, joined up with Washington coming across, and they saw the British coming in, and Israel was really, really disheartened when he saw the Connecticut troops fleeing. They were racing. Of course, you couldn't blame them too much because the British outnumbered them in by great, great numbers, and there's not much they could do. But the big problem then was how the heck to get Israel's 3,000 to join Washington's 3,000, 5,000 without being cut off. Because you had Manhattan Island, which was then pretty much, an area of farms and tiny villages, and they would have to go up like the west side of Manhattan Island. So what happened is the British officers came ashore and they went to this mansion of a person named Murray. And Murray wasn't there, but his wife, Mary, was. And Mary invited the General Howe and the other British officers, the top officers, in for wine and cake. And she kept them occupied for an hour. And while she did that, the story goes that she sent one of her servants up to the top story and watched out to the west to see if Israel Putnam's troops had passed through yet. And when they finally passed through, the servant came down and told Mary Murray what had happened. She went and told her daughters, let's wrap up things here. And she said to the British, thank you and goodbye. And by the time they got outside, Israel Putnam and his 3,000 were all safe on their way up to Harlem. And there's a plaque down on Park Avenue, New York today, and it says, in honor of Mary Murray, for services rendered her country during the American Revolution, entertaining in her home. So this is not just a wild story. This is true. Entertaining in her home on this site, General Howe and his officers, until the American troops under General Putnam escaped. And I thought that was cool. There's a lot of plaques that I've come across, but this is a really important one here, because if he had cut off Putnam, Washington probably would not have had enough troops to continue the revolution. After that, Putnam. A few weeks later was the Battle of Harlem Heights, and the Americans won that, and they forced the British to retreat. But then, of course, the British brought up, they had so many thousands of troops, they brought up more, and Washington had to continue on to White Plains. And at the Battle of White Plains, Washington again was able to escape, but at that time he sent Putnam across the river because the rumors were the British were going to turn left and attack the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. So Putnam had to protect them. And Washington stayed behind, and Greene was getting well by this time, and he could help out. There's one episode that occurred a few months before when the Americans were in Manhattan, and Washington was there, and Putnam was there. Putnam was out on the street, and there was a case where there was a mob of men, and they had these guys on metal rails and put those rails on their shoulders and were parading these men through the streets of Manhattan and humiliating them and torturing them on these sharp rails. Putnam saw this, and this is the first time he saw something like this, and he went over to them and he was shocked, and he stopped it. He said, "Stop this now," and he broke it up. And then he went to Washington's headquarters, and he told Washington what he had seen. And Washington said to him, "We can't discourage these sort of proceedings because these men are fighting, the cause of liberty. And if you stop them, they might perceive that you're not in support of the cause." Now, Putnam wasn't the kind of guy to take a no even from Washington. So he got together with one of his generals, General Mifflin, and they went to the Continental Congress and they complained. Again, the Continental Congress wasn't very sympathetic, but they passed a mild resolution condemning this. And if I know anything about Putnam, he made sure that wherever he was in charge, this kind of thing didn't happen. And at the end of the year, of the next year, he was in charge. He was in charge of Philadelphia. He had under martial law, and he was very strict about any time his troops or anyone else would mistreat like civilians and people that even people who were opposed to the to independence and were supporters of the king. So he had a lot of criticism coming from people who were extreme patriots. The rest of Putnam's time in the North was spent in the Hudson Valley in New York in the war. He was put in charge of the land from the Connecticut River to the Hudson River and down to Long Island Sound. So that would include Portchester. Okay, that was under him for like the whole rest of pretty much the rest of the time of the northern half of the war. After that, the war went to the south and the Carolinas and Georgia, Virginia. But at this time, this was the heart of the war. Okay, New York State. Okay, and so Putnam's there in the Hudson Highlands up at Fishkill, and that, by the way, I looked it up, and the Van Wyck House is still there, and you can visit it. And I did visit it when I was researching the book, and I would recommend it to everyone. But I looked it up just recently, and I found out because of the COVID crisis, it's closed, which is not surprising. Unfortunately, a lot of historical is the Portchester Historical Society building closed? It is too, yeah. It'll be great when it opens because I have a feeling that a lot of people are saving up their little day trips for that sort of thing. So anyway, he's in charge of the Hudson Highlands, and there was one serious problem, which I got into a little bit before, about Alexander Hamilton. October 1777, Washington's General Burgoyne's troops up at Saratoga, New York, defeated the British. That was one of the great victories of the war, one of the 2 or 3 greatest American victories of the war. And that led directly to the French committing money and troops to the American cause. And that in turn led to Yorktown in the winning of the war. So Saratoga was something. But at that time, Washington asked 20-year-old Alexander Hamilton to go up and get some more troops for him to be sent down to New Jersey. He did. He talked to Burgoyne, and on the way back, he stopped at Putnam's headquarters and demanded troops. Putnam didn't like that. He did. I don't think he took it seriously. I didn't think he took it as if they were Washington's orders. Well, Hamilton came back and really criticized Putnam to Washington. It was probably the low point of Putnam's career, at least during the Revolution. All right. And Washington was really angry, and he expressed it to Putnam, and Putnam did immediately send the troops as soon as Washington asked for them. But it caused a little problem there, and Washington couldn't do much about Putnam because by that time, Putnam was in seniority-wise, was his top general. So Putnam pretty much stayed at his post, but he didn't receive any fighting orders. The fighting had to come to him. Now, one thing that might have affected Putnam's state of mind when he had this problem might have been what happened to his wife, Deborah. Now, they had only been married for about 10 years, and Deborah was following Israel, as a lot of the generals' wives did, following him from his post to his post. So she was with him at Fishkill when he was directing the troops there. And one week he was off with the troops to the south and had to leave her even though she was ill. And when he was gone, she died. But it's worse than that. When he got back, he was going to send her body back home to Eastern Connecticut, but then changed his mind and left her in a crypt that she was buried in at Garrison. After that, not much is heard until the early 1900s. There's an article in the New York Times where a descendant of Alexander Hamilton, who was also a veteran colonel from the Civil War, he wrote a letter to one of the most important New York businessmen and told a story about someone he knew, an Irish laborer who was sent to Garrison in the 1860s to move graves. And one of the graves he needed to move for expansion of the Episcopal Church there was Deborah Putnam's grave. And when he opened it up, he said he was immediately struck with the notion that she had been buried alive. Now combine that with Israel not moving her body. Why? Combining it with the fact he wasn't around when she died, probably wasn't around when she was buried, because surely Israel would have known the difference between a dead person and a live person after what he had seen in 2 wars. But what happened? And we don't know. Oh, she was immediately reburied, according to this Irishman, and then her grave's never been opened. But it's a sad, sad story. And I did mention it and pondered it because at that time, there were a lot of cases of being buried alive, premature burial. As a matter of fact, Edgar Allan Poe, a few decades later, wrote a short story on a similar case. Anyway, that certainly affected Putnam greatly because they were very close, and her children were like his children too. Anyway, the next year, Putnam was in Connecticut, back in Connecticut again, near Danbury, at a place called Reading for his winter encampment, which is called Connecticut's Valley Forge because it involved many, many troops crowded in the small huts for a really, really cold winter. And at that time, Putnam encountered something he had never seen before, and that was a mutiny. His troops weren't paid by the government, by the state legislature in Hartford. They were very poorly clothed. They were very poorly equipped, and the men decided to mutiny. Now, Putnam's first biographer, Humphreys, was one of Putnam's aides at the time, so he personally witnessed this. So that's one thing Putnam put down that was absolutely correct. And he quoted, he was there when Putnam spoke to the men to put down the mutiny. And I'll just read a few words that he said. Putnam spoke to the men just as they were going to march on Hartford. Whither are you going? Do you intend to desert your officers and invite the enemy to follow you into the country? Whose cause have you been fighting and suffering for so long, if not your own? Have you no property, no parents, wives, or children? Have you behaved like men? So you have behaved like men so far, for all the world has your praises, and posterity will stand astonished at your deeds, but not if you spoil it all at last. Don't you consider how much the country is distressed by the war, and that your officers are not much better paid than yourself? Think what a shame would be for Connecticut men to run away from their officers. Immediately afterwards, everyone fell back in line, and they had a regimental parade. Everyone back to their quarters. Only one soldier, the one who had been the most active, was confined to the guardhouse. At that night, he tried to escape, but one of the guards shot him dead. And that guard was also one of the mutineers, by the way. And that was the end of the affair, and no one ever mutinied. So Putnam had a good rapport, a good way with the common soldiers, the enlisted men. Now, the last episode. Any questions before I get to the last major episode of Putnam's life? I hope people are still there. Are they, Kiki? Okay. I know one is because I see you, but on my cell phone here, I can't see anyone else. Okay.
Yeah, there's still a lot of people here.
Okay, great. The last episode occurred 3 miles from the Portchester border in the town of of Greenwich, and this portion of Greenwich was called at the time Horse Neck. And it's found today, this episode occurred right on Route 1, about halfway across the town. And you can go today, I think I might have mentioned it to you, to what's called the Knapp Tavern or the Putnam Cottage, a red colonial building, which was a tavern at that time and was for many years afterwards. And at that place or near it, Putnam was either in that building or one of two others, and he was inspecting the troops along the coast, the New York coast, Portchester, and up to Stamford and Bridgeport. And he was staying overnight there with 150 men and 2 cannon. He got word that the British would be approaching. The British under British Governor William Tryon. Now, Tryon was not only governor of New York, but he was also a British general. And he had 1,500 soldiers, including horse soldiers with him. In other words, 10 times what Putnam had. So what Putnam first glimpse of this, he was looking in the mirror as he was shaving, and he saw a patch of red. And then he turned around and looked out the window and saw a red coat. That's when he first saw it. Immediately, he took his sword and his coat, his hat, ran out to his horse and ran over to his 150 troops and told them to hurry on east to the town of Stamford. And right there was a hill that was almost, they say it was almost perpendicular. I mean, it was like almost straight down the side of the hill, and there were anywhere from 60 to 90 stone steps for people who had to go up and down that hill. Putnam sent his men on either side of the hill, took longer, but either side of the hill so they could go on to Stamford, while he alone stood at the top of the hill. As soon as the British troops approached him on their horses, Putnam got on his horse and plunged down the hill. The British troops, even though were a lot younger than Putnam, who was like almost 62 years old, they stopped at the top of the hill and refused to follow him. And that's where a little common saying came into play at that time. Putnam, they refused to follow Putnam. They did not dare follow him. Because Putnam, what he did, and he plunged down the hill, one of the bullets from the British pierced his beaver hat. And then when he got to the bottom of the hill, he turned around at the enemy, shook his fist at them, and swore out as loud as he could. And then, and only then, he continued on, and his men were far ahead now, and the British couldn't keep up with them. Meanwhile, the British went around the hill the long way to get at Putnam, but by then he was far away. But then one story, and this one I don't have any real serious, except one person mentioned this. So I will mention it because it's interesting, and that is on the way to Stamford, Putnam came across 2 little girls who were playing outside their small house. And he stopped and told them, go in your house. Then he yelled for their mother and said, come out here and get them because British horses are coming. And then he continued on. Now, I bring that up not because I think it's a great story, but I think because that is exactly what Putnam would have done. Knowing something about his character, reading so much about him, that's exactly the kind of person he was. Anyway, he continued on. He got to Stamford, turned his men around, and went after the British. Now, by then, he knew the British were retreating because they were after assault works in the town of Greenwich, and they had accomplished their mission by destroying it, so they were gone. But Putnam was able to capture 50 stragglers from the British soldiers. At that, at the end of the week, the British general sent a message to Putnam, I want to do an exchange. I want to exchange prisoners I have for those British soldiers that you captured. And He also sent Putnam a gift of a suit of clothes, which included a new hat. And the British general explained that this was not because of anything in the military action. It was because Putnam had treated the POWs so well. So again, this occurs. We're in the French and Indian War. He had treated the prisoners of war very well. And now again, in this war, he's treating them very well too. Okay, that's February 1779. By the way, up until this year, because of the coronavirus, they had a celebration with a reenactment in Greenwich at the Putnam Cottage every year. I spoke at one 2 or 3 years ago. It was really great to go to. Hopefully next year, or at least the year after, they will start that up again. Okay, at the end of February, they have that, and anyone in the town of Portchester within 10 or 15 minutes can reach it. Okay, and Putnam served up here getting recruits, getting recruits for the army, going back to the Hudson Highlands and supervising the troops there. And at the end of the war, he was with his son Daniel, the same Daniel who was plowing with the oxen in the field just before Bunker Hill. Anne Humphreys, who would 10 years later become his first biographer. He was bringing those two aides back with him to New Jersey, and he was going to settle down for the winter at George Washington's encampment in New Jersey, which would be just like Valley Forge. It was at Morristown. And when I was at Morristown giving a talk about a year or two ago, I gave one at the historical site down there. And I mentioned to them, I says, right now we are standing or sitting right on the spot Israel Putnam was headed to when his military career ended abruptly. And what happened, he was headed toward Hartford from the east, and his right hand became numb. He was on horseback. Right hand became numb, then his right foot became numb. And then he started shaking him to try to get this blood circulating again, and his whole right side turned numb and started to become paralyzed. Now, you know what happened? He had a stroke. And he thought if he could rest up, he might overcome it. So he stopped at a friend's house in Hartford, was there for a while, no way. And probably for the most disappointing point in his military career, he had to turn around and head back home. And that's where he spent the winter, back on his farm. He survived it. He survived it to such an extent that a few months later, he went to visit the troops in the Hudson Highlands. And it was about the same, it was the same time that Benedict Arnold was found to have committed treason in trying to turn over West Point. And that was the big topic of conversation. And Putnam was talking to the troops here about it. But then at the end, he had to go back home again because he just could not do anything. And for the rest of his life, and he lived for another 10 or 11 years, for the rest of his life, his right arm hung uselessly at his side. He couldn't get on a horse without help, but he could ride. And he was still active. May 29th, 1790, George Washington has now been president for a couple of years, but the US Constitution, even though it was ratified 2 or 3 years before, it wasn't signed by all the states. Rhode Island still had to sign it. And so on that day, Rhode Island finally signed it by barely enough people in the Rhode Island legislature. On that day, just across the border in Connecticut, Israel Putnam died. He died with his boots on, but with 14 visible scars and a long scar on his left cheek left by a tomahawk years and years before in the French and Indian War. One of his friends, Timothy Dwight, a scholar and local minister, who later, a few years later, became president of Yale, wrote for Putnam's for the epitaph on Putnam's grave, "Passenger, if you are a soldier, drop a tear over the dust of a hero, who ever attentive to the lives and happiness of his men, dared to lead where any dared to follow." Today, that stone is now in the state capitol building in Hartford, inside a glass cabinet, and it's not rectangular anymore, it's oval. It's oval because for a century after Putnam's death, visitors, tourists would chip off the corners for souvenirs. Matter of fact, you could barely read some of the words because they took up so much of the stone. But in its place, they erected this giant equestrian statue in the center of Brooklyn. They took Putnam's remains, transferred them from there to the ground underneath that statue, and that's where he rests today. In the decades after Putnam's death, Washington Irving, one of the greatest writers of the early 19th century America, said of Putnam, Israel Putnam, one of the talismanic names of the Revolution, the very mention of which is like the sound of a trumpet. That's what they thought of Putnam in the mid 1800s. A couple decades later, 1875, the 100th anniversary of Bunker Hill, General William Tecumseh Sherman went to Boston to be the keynote speaker. And he said, he looked at this 221-foot high obelisk and said, you know, I think that Colonel Prescott was the actual commander at Bunker Hill. However, General Putnam, quote, has ample honor without claiming this. He was a glorious old soldier, and his services and example are worth a dozen monuments like this on Bunker Hill, even if made of pure gold, unquote. Today, I'd recommend to anyone who, one more thing. 8 years ago, an action game, video game came out, a very popular one called Assassin's Creed. And one of the main characters is Israel Putnam, okay? It's a fictional character, but I think they captured the spirit of Putnam very well. So if you have a chance and you can play that, go to it. It's Assassin's Creed 3. I recommend, I wish this was like before and we didn't have the COVID-19 virus, but we do. So you can only visit some places, but I wrote down for you a few places I think you ought to go to that you can take day trips and be away from people, all right? You can be pretty safe. One is Bunker Hill Monument. You could go up there, but you can't go in the monument. It's closed. So you can't see too much. So maybe that's not such a great thing. As I mentioned last time, the Wolf Den, where he shot the wolf back when he was 25 years old, is in a Connecticut state park up on the near the Massachusetts border. And you can go there and it's wonderfully safe. They have a little parking lot and you walk a short distance and you go right to the wolf den, and all around you are acres and acres and acres of empty forest. And this time of year, you can see a long distance because the leaves are all off the trees. So on a nice warm day, matter of fact, I'm going to convince myself to go up there because it's such a great place to go on a fall day. Another place is Putnam Park, and that's only about maybe 30 minutes from Portchester, maybe even less. And that's right up in Reading. And that too is all spread out, and they have grouped the stones of the campfires and put them up in little piles where the cabins were that the soldiers slept in that last night of the war in Connecticut. And they also have a nice museum inside, but they have two of them, two small ones, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend in if you're careful about being safe. But you can certainly tour the grounds, and just that alone on a nice day is a great thing. And then across the street is a nice park where they have picnic facilities. And then Greenwich. The Horseneck Escape, okay? You can go to the Putnam cottage, walk around it. You can walk over to the hill. There's a plaque there on a stone describing what happened there at the top of the hill. You can walk around. You can walk underneath the hill. There's a school right there, and you can kind of get a feel for what it was like in Putnam's day. Just keep in mind one thing: in the 1930s. They filled in a lot of the hill underneath Route 1. So when you go down, you might say, well, this isn't that big a hill. Well, no, it's not now, because they put so much fill in and then repaved Route 1 right on top of it. But if you look at the sides of that hill, there are still some stone steps there. Most people think they were from that time, but I think they're probably from about the early 1900s. But they look like the steps that were described in the story of the Horseneck Escape. So those are a few places related to Putnam that you might go to. I would not recommend this year going to the Van Wyck Hill Homestead in Fishkill, because that is all hemmed in by highways. There's hardly any land there. And the most important thing about it is going inside and seeing where Putnam had his main headquarters. Are there any questions?
So no chance that Putnam was in Portchester's homestead?
Oh, no, I as I mentioned to Kiki before, I would say if I had to put money on it, I would say that the chances are better than even that Putnam had stayed over there at different times. Because after all, for a long period of time, he was responsible for the troops in all that area, all the way down to the coast. So when he went down there, and back then you didn't just drive down in an hour or two. You came down, you stayed over. You stayed overnight there. And so I would say there's a good chance that any large gathering place, a tavern, any kind of like church building that was large enough to house troops, to provide accommodations for top officers, I would say it's a good candidate for that distinction. Now, whether there's written records, I know of none, and I don't think that anyone there has discovered anything that was definitive. But I don't think anyone's discovered anything definitive the other way either, that wasn't the headquarters.
But would we assume that, General Putnam would not be traveling by himself, that he would have himself an aide de camp and like a couple of other people, like 4 people, 10 people?
Yes, at the very least. Yes.
Like 10 people?
Well, he had to have protection. Right.
All right.
And you have a couple like aides. That's not really great protection for a major general. Mm-hmm. So I'd have to do some research on other officers of his rank to see if I could find exactly how many people they traveled with, but I can't make a definite statement on Putnam how many he had. But I would say, when he came back and when he had the stroke and he's heading back with his 2 aides, he might have not been accompanied by other troops, because that was in his home territory. Northeastern Connecticut was pretty safe territory at that time. So, but New York was totally different because New York City was occupied by the British, and they stayed down there for the rest of the war. So that was a very dangerous area. And, over and over again, there were plans for them to go up the Hudson and break through and reach Canada and have troops from Canada come down, because that would have been a tremendous, and that's why Benedict Arnold's Traitors Action was so important, because West Point was so important. If he had actually succeeded in getting British troops onto that peninsula at West Point, that might have been the turning point of the war right there in favor of the British. So, and that's why this area needed a major general in charge of it. And like I said, his territory consisted of everything down south to Long Island Sound. So yeah, I would say definitely that would be a candidate for his visiting more than once during his time of service. I would love to hear more about that, and if I have an opportunity to dig into any archives down there, if you find any, I'd be love to go down there and just like, go through them like a mole and find what I can, because I got a feeling there's more information on that somewhere that someone has. You'd be surprised. I ran across that. I'll give you an example of something I ran across up in Massachusetts a couple years ago when I was doing research on the biography of Putnam's cousin Rufus. And I was in a small library in, I think it was Sutton, Mass, which is near Worcester. And I was just going through the historical section and I came across a book of clippings from books and newspapers from the 1800s. And I'm flipping through it, finding all these things that are kind of pasted on pages. And I came across the only picture I had ever seen of a close Israel Putnam family member. Oh, there's pictures of the general, but I found a picture of his son, Daniel. The Daniel I just spoke of, okay? And he also, by the way, was the Daniel who accompanied his father in an expedition between the wars up the Mississippi River. And he was also the Daniel who stayed at Cambridge at headquarters when Putnam went off to fight at Bunker Hill. He was right in the heart of things. And he was also the Daniel who, as I say, was later one of Putnam's aides, military aides. Anyway, it was a picture of Daniel in his 60s. And if I had my projector here, I would show you that picture right now, because obviously I took a picture of it. And I would love to have pictures of Hannah and Deborah, Putnam's wives, because that is so, and there's so few. Like if I want to find pictures of Abigail Adams, no problem. All right. Putnam, other very wealthy people, other wealthy women, there's a good chance you're going to find their pictures because there are paintings done. But not too many professional painters came to Eastern Connecticut and painted pictures of farmers and their wives. They just didn't. Any other comments, questions?
I had just one quick question going all the way back to Breed's Hill.
Mhm.
So I don't know if you could just talk a little bit about what kind of fortifications would have been built overnight, just like what would that look like?
Well, they took wheelbarrows with picks and shovels up there. And basically it was taking the dirt and using those, and fence posts, using those as protection from the musket fire of the British and maybe the cannon fire of the British when they were going to be attacking them the following day. So they only had a few hours to do it. So it had to be, they had to be just like the earth and whatever wood pieces they could carry up to the top of the hill. So they didn't bring along with them many construction materials. It had to be found right there. Okay. And there were railings, fence railings and stuff for the farms there. So it wasn't like it was unused land or forested land. It was farmland. There's a great diorama up at the museum at Bunker Hill that shows the location of the troops, where everything was. And you can go online, and if you type in Bunker Hill in Wikipedia, I think it's one of the pictures they have. If it isn't, just Google Bunker Hill diorama, and you should come across a picture of it, and you have a very good idea, layout of the land and the kind of fortification. But there was one thing Putnam mentioned about that. He said something like, make sure if the men are covered partially, there'll be a problem. But if you cover them pretty much so that their bodies are protected, that they'll fight all day. I wish I had the exact quote, but it's in my book. And when you write a book, after 5 years, you forget what was in it. Matter of fact, yeah, whenever I give a talk, and I've given many talks, before every talk, I've got to flip through my own book and refresh my mind to some of the details, because there's so much rich detail behind Putnam and behind the Revolutionary War. But no, that's a good question. That's a good question about that. Do I have like 2 minutes to throw a little story on here? I'm going to throw a couple of little Putnam stories in that I thought are really interesting, and they usually spice up my talks. One is to show the personality of the guy. One day during the American Revolution, he was coming ashore, and I don't remember exactly where, but it's not really that important. He was coming ashore in a rowboat. He was being rowed ashore in his general's uniform. And some of the troops on shore were watching him come, and one of the enlisted men said, "Who is that? Who's that in their rowboat that's coming?" And another man said, "Oh, that's old Put." One of the officers heard this and went over to the man and said, "Put him under arrest." And then Putnam came to shore. He stepped onto the land and he went over to the officer and he said, "I saw what happened. What's going on here? It looks like you arrested that man." And he goes, "Yes, I did." And Putnam said, "Why'd you do it?" And he says, "Because he insulted you, sir." And Putnam says, "How?" And he said, "He called you old Put." And Putnam said, "But I am old Put." And then he said, "Release that man." And because he didn't care. He wasn't the kind of guy that was like really into formalities and fake respect. He was just like a plain old farmer. That's what he was. Plain old farmer, but one who could fight. One other thing he hated was dueling. At that time, dueling was very common. And of course, the most famous duel is the one in 1804 between Hamilton and Burr. But back then in the war it was too. And one time a British officer had threatened, had been insulted by Putnam, he said, and he challenged him to a duel. He said, "Let's meet." And Putnam said, "Well, since you challenged me, I get to choose weapons. So you come to my tent and I'll have the weapons there the next morning." So he comes into Putnam's tent, and Putnam's sitting down smoking a pipe. And next to him is a chair. And between him and the chair is a keg of gunpowder. And he motions to the British officer who was a prisoner of war. He motions to him to have free run of the camp to sit in that chair. He does. Putnam takes 2 wooden matches and sticks them in the top of the keg of gunpowder. He says, "This for you, this for me." And he takes his pipe and he lights them. And the matches start going down and down. And the British officer's looking at him, getting nervous, starting to sweat. Putnam's there, and he's not only calm smoking his pipe, but he's not even looking at the matches. Finally, the officer gets up because "I just can't take this anymore." And he starts getting out of the tent. And Putnam starts laughing at him. And he laughs and he says, "Just like I expected, you're afraid of a barrel of onions." Because that's all it was. And what Putnam had done is he took like flakes, little gunpowder, and put it on the top of the barrel. So when the matches got down near it, they started sparking. And that's what scared the British man, because he thought the whole thing was going to blow. That was Putnam's sense of humor. Any others? Okay, I want to thank everyone for showing up tonight. And I want to thank you for especially for waiting while I corrected technical problems. And that usually doesn't happen. And when it does, I go scurrying around trying to figure out what the heck's wrong here. But fortunately, we came through. And I wasn't joking. I'm going to send you down a few of the pencils I have made up for some of my talks that I give away with my books. And because I think you'll like them, and because I don't expect any more Israel Putnam in-person talks for another few months.
Well, we definitely want to say thanks very much. I think we appreciate this. And I feel like this has maybe inspired us to do, some more digging around and see if we could find any, more specific Putnam stuff. So
Great.
Jordan, I don't know if you have anything to say.
No, just thank you so much for your time. This was really fascinating. And and thank you, Kiki, so much for helping coordinate all this. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I definitely did.
Yeah, you did a great job coordinating it. You did.
Good evening.
All
Good
right.
night. Good
Thank
night.
you very much to everybody. Have a good
Thank
night.
you.
Maybe we'll do it and figure out something else soon. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Night.
Night.